Thank you everyone for coming today to this forum. My name is Daney Faddoul and I'm Campaign Manager at the Human Rights Law Centre, with my main focus being the campaign for an Australian Human Rights Act. I begin by acknowledging that wherever we are, we're coming from Aboriginal land. In my case, the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, pay respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. And when it comes to why we need a Human Rights Act, it benefits everyone, but marginalised communities benefit more so. And First Nations communities have endured human rights violations longer than any other part of the community. Our speakers for the panel today are Hugh Kretser, President of the Australian Human Rights Commission. Hugh commenced his 5-year term as President of the Commission on the 30th of July 2024, which followed 2 decades advancing human rights as the CEO of the Yuruk Justice Commission, Executive Director of the Human Rights Law Centre, and Executive Officer of the Victorian Federation of Community Legal Centres, and a range of board governance and advisory positions. Secondly, on our panel is Nikita White, Strategic Campaigner at Amnesty International Australia. Nikita has almost a decade of experience working on a range of domestic and international human rights issues. With academic qualifications in law and international relations, Nikita brings a strong legal and strategic lens to her work. She leads Amnesty International Australia's campaign for a Human Rights Act. Our third panellist is Caitlin Reiger, Chief Executive Officer of the Human Rights Law Centre. Caitlin's human rights legal and policy expertise spans 25 years, working on access to justice at both national and international levels, including accessibility and accountability for mass human rights violations at the United Nations, with national governments and in community organisations in places like Myanmar, Timor-Leste, Sierra Leone, Cambodia and Colombia, as well as Victoria's truth-telling process, the Yuruk Justice Commission, and the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. I will ask each panel member a couple of questions in turn. Then, if time is available, some questions from the audience. To ask a question, please use the Q&A section at the bottom panel of your Zoom that you're using today to join this webinar. So, my first question is for Hugh. To set the scene, could you summarise why we need an Australian Human Rights Act, noting you've got a 5-year free and equal consultation to summarise, so that might be quite a feat.
Thanks, Danny, and great to be here and join everyone from Gadigal land. I always start by saying, well, what are human rights? So go back to basics. So human rights, it's obviously an engaged and educated audience, but how we talk about human rights and the benefits is absolutely critical to understanding why we need a Human Rights Act in Australia. So human rights are the fundamental rules that governments around the world have agreed to uphold that seek to ensure that every single person, no matter who we are or where we are, can enjoy a decent, dignified life. They reflect values like freedom, equality, respect, dignity, kindness, looking out for each other and thinking about other people. And so the world community came together after the horrors of World War II and drafted and approved one of the pinnacles of human achievement, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And Australia was closely involved in the drafting of the Declaration and the approving of the Declaration. Doc Evatt, an Australian, was President of the General Assembly when it was drafted. That's the good news. Australia has played this pivotal role in setting these global standards that are there to ensure peace, prosperity, and well-being for everyone in the world. We've then successive governments have signed and ratified the key international treaties that followed the Universal Declaration. But what we haven't done is properly embed those human rights principles in our domestic law, and that's what a Human Rights Act would do. Currently, we've got human rights protected in a piecemeal way through anti-discrimination laws, through other laws for example, NDIS, laws that create schools and things like that, but we have no comprehensive protection of those laws that internationally Australia has agreed to sign up to. And that means that people's rights aren't protected as properly as they should be. And there's examples of where that creates problems in Australia. We can look to the Aged Care Royal Commission, Disability Royal Commission, Robo-Debt, the treatment of Australian citizens trying to return home during COVID, or raids by the federal police on the ABC or the home of a journalist for their role in exposing potential war crimes. These are the federal level examples of human rights failings. We can go back earlier, look at the treatment of, entrenched inequality, treatment of First Nations people, people with disability and the like. These are the things that a Human Rights Act would help to address. And Human Rights Act basically does two things. It requires government authorities to think about human rights and act compatibly with human rights when they're making decisions, creating laws, delivering services, delivering policies, and it forces them to make those decisions in a human-focused way. So it delivers better laws, better policies, better practices that make people's lives better in Australia. So that's what a Human Rights Act does. The good news is we have one in Victoria, in ACT and Queensland, but we don't have one nationally. My predecessor, Rosalind Croucher at the Australian Human Rights Commission, led a multi-year project looking at how we could strengthen the protection of human rights in Australia. We called it the Free and Equal Project, and the number one recommendation of that project was a National Human Rights Act, alongside a range of other reforms to better protect people's rights in Australia.
Thank you so much for that, Hugh. My next question is for you, Caitlin. Could you share the importance of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights inquiry into Australia's human rights framework, and has there been a federal government response to it?
Yeah, thanks, Danny, and nice to be here as well, coming from Wurundjeri country in Melbourne. So the Parliamentary Joint Committee inquiry that took place last year was a really important step forward. It was launched by the Albanese government in its first term and really gave the mandate to look into the entirety of how Australia's human rights framework is working and how it can be strengthened. It came out with a really clear set of recommendations last year, which gives us really a roadmap for what needs to happen next. It received over 300 submissions from all around the country, and overwhelmingly people were supportive and calling for a Human Rights Act as the first step that needs to be taken. The committee looked into a number of things and came up with some other great recommendations as well around how to strengthen the committee's own role in looking at legislation, the role of the Human Rights Commission, the need for better human rights education across government. But the centrepiece and number one recommendation it came out with was you have to start by legislating what human rights are and how people can access them, and what that means for guiding government decision-making and all public decision-making really in the federal sphere. And we know that, as Hugh's mentioned, this would actually put human rights into the heart of all public decision-making, and that would actually benefit everybody. Effectively, what a Human Rights Act does is clarify, codify, and protect our basic human rights. It would mean children at school would learn what those human rights mean. It would bring that language of human rights into our federal sphere, which we know is still missing. Not only did those sort of scandals that came out of the Royal Commissions that Hugh mentioned show why we do need these kinds of protections, that there are people who fall through the gaps in our complicated piecemeal set of legal protections that we have. But we also can look to all of the examples in the 3 state and territory jurisdictions that already have human rights legislation in place. So that goes right back to 2004 in the ACT, to 2006 in Victoria, and 2019 in Queensland. And we have practical examples of how people then can use this as a tool when they need to remind decision makers that people need to be taken into consideration. That might be, the woman in Queensland who was being evicted from her social housing because of damage caused by a previous partner, and she was able to use human rights arguments to avoid being evicted. And these are really practical things. We've had similar, stories of people who have been able to get off, really unnecessarily long wait lists for medical treatment, for example, when because of their age, they could make a human rights-based argument about why they needed to get treatment. So there's really practical reasons why this would make a huge difference. And the Parliamentary Joint Committee coming out so clearly, not only recommending a Human Rights Act, but even putting forward a draft sample bill at the outset of its report is the next big step. The next thing now is for the federal government to deliver its response, and it has not yet given a response to that inquiry report, but we're expecting that will be coming very soon, and we will be talking to federal MPs across the board and the government in particular around when we can expect to see a legislated Human Rights Act process starting to move forward now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Caitlin. Nikita, could you share an outline of the campaigning and advocacy, both by Amnesty International and more generally, that has happened over the last while, including in the recent federal election period, to pursue an Australian Human Rights Act?
Yes, thanks so much for having me. So Amnesty, alongside partners like the Human Rights Law Centre, have campaigned for a Human Rights Act for a really long time, both inside and outside Parliament. We ramped up our campaign, as did a lot of partner organisations, after the Albanese government was elected in 2022. Outside Parliament, a lot of what that campaign is about raising awareness. We know there's a lot of confusion about whether Australia has a Human Rights Act. We know we do polling, and most people in Australia actually think we already have one. So we're always campaigning to show people the fact that we don't have a Human Rights Act, but also the difference an act would make to people's lives. You know, we hear a lot about the issues facing people around Australia accessing healthcare, finding housing, and a big part of this campaign is showing people that if we had a Human Rights Act, that it would make their lives better, that they would have access to healthcare, affordable healthcare, that they would have somewhere safe and secure to sleep. And because there are already acts in the ACT in Victoria, Queensland, we're also able to show the difference those acts have made in people's lives. And that's a big part of our campaign. If you're interested, in particular, if you're having conversations with people about a Human Rights Act, you can find all that information on our website, as long as the Human Rights Law Centre's and the Human Rights Commission's websites. And they're really helpful, a lot of these examples, when it comes to talking to people about why we need a Human Rights Act. We also work to build support and mobilize that support across the country for a Human Rights Act. We do polling, as I mentioned, and that polling shows there is really strong support from the general public for a Human Rights Act. There are about 3 in 4 people who pretty consistently show they support a Human Rights Act, and it's actually only 3% of people who oppose an act. So we know this is something that if the government decides to act on, there is strong support. And we have been calling for the government to act on that support, as I mentioned, for a really long time, but particularly since 2022. People who attend this may know last time Labor was in government, they established a federal human rights framework. They held the Brennan inquiry. Unfortunately, that did recommend legislating a Human Rights Act, but unfortunately, Labor didn't act on that recommendation, but they did establish a federal human rights framework. And in their policy platform in 2022, there was a call to review that framework. And so when they were elected, we joined with Human Rights Law Centre, lots of other partners, to call for this review to happen. And as Caitlin mentioned, the government did that review through the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights. And that was advocacy that we were doing, calling for the inquiry. You know, we met with a lot of MPs from Labor, but also across Parliament. That was really helped by the Human Rights Commission's release of their free and equal position paper on a Human Rights Act that outlined in a lot of detail why an act is needed, but also what rights should be included, how an act would work, even how provisions could be drafted. So we had a really strong basis for the inquiry. And as Kayla mentioned, after that was released, Dreyfus did refer to an inquiry, the review of the federal human rights framework. And there was such a strong show of support from organizations. We also had over 4,000 Amnesty activists who sent submissions to the inquiry. And this inquiry, which was led by Labor, I think it's important to highlight, did recommend legislating a Human Rights Act. It also recommended, improving human rights education, strengthening parliamentary scrutiny of human rights. And those are all incredibly positive recommendations. We are particularly focused on the recommendation for a Human Rights Act because, as we know, last time Labor held an inquiry like this, they didn't proceed with legislating a Human Rights Act despite the overwhelming show of support. So now with where we're at, we are building on the free and equal position paper on the recommendations from the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights Inquiry, which provide a lot of detail on what the act should look like, aligned with that free and equal position paper. So it's a really strong recommendation for us to base our campaigning and advocacy on. And we're in a really positive position with calling for the government to respond to that recommendation. Obviously, we're calling for them to accept the recommendations, all of them, but particularly that recommendation to legislate a Human Rights Act. And we focused on that during the federal election campaign. We're going to continue calling, campaigning, meeting with MPs to get the government to accept the recommendation, commit to legislating a Human Rights Act in this term of Parliament. The last thing I wanted to highlight in terms of going into this term of Parliament, the good news is the composition of Parliament means a Human Rights Act could pass at any time. Labor has a lot of MPs in the House of Representatives, so if they commit to legislating one and draft one, they could pass it, and then the Greens, with the Greens' support in the Senate, that could be passed because the Greens have a long-standing policy of supporting a Human Rights Act. So we are, with the inquiry, with the support from civil society that's been built up and from the general public that's been built up over the last few years, we are in a really positive position when it comes to getting a Human Rights Act happening.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Nikita. Over to you, Hugh, for what might be a very big question. What prospects for an Australian Human Rights Act do you see following the recent federal election?
I think a Human Rights Act will happen. It's just a question of when it will happen. And I think Nikita and Caitlin have talked about some of the opportunities that exist in the current term of Parliament for the Albanese government to commit to making this long or overdue reform happen. And those are the response to the Parliamentary Joint Committee report, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights report, which recommended a Human Rights Act. There's also the response to the Disability Royal Commission. And that's an interesting one because they looked at the treatment of the mistreatment of people with disabilities around Australia. The Commission has recommended a Disability Rights Act, and I understand that they did that because they felt they were constrained by their jurisdiction to focus on the rights of people with disability. The disability sector has responded to that by saying, we don't want a specific Disability Rights Act, we want a Human Rights Act that protects the rights of people with disability and other people. And of course, there's intersecting human rights issues there as well. So there's those two opportunities in terms of government responses. There's also the opportunity in January next year in Geneva at the UN Human Rights Council. Australia's human rights record will be reviewed in a process known as the Universal Periodic Review. And that's like a peer review process where all the UN member states look at Australia's human rights record and make recommendations to improve it. And in the lead up to those reviews, what nations typically do is make voluntary commitments to do better on human rights, to strengthen the protection of human rights. And so this is another golden opportunity, these things aligning for the Albanese government to say, we're going to implement a Human Rights Act. And on election night, it was fantastic to see the Prime Minister talk about the enduring foundations of fairness, equality, and respect for each other in our nation. And so those kinds of values that he spoke about are directly aligned with the kind of principles and values and standards that a Human Rights Act would protect in Australia and provide that foundation, as Caitlin said, for building education around human rights of school kids and within government and within the whole community to say these are the standards that we stand for as a nation. We expect new citizens to say, when they promise, they make a pledge to uphold the rights and liberties of Australia. We need governments to make like a reverse citizenship pledge to say, we promise to uphold those rights and liberties, and will do so through a piece of legislation, which is called the Human Rights Act.
Thank you so much for that, Hugh. Nikita, what role will Amnesty International and its activists be playing to push forward an Australian Human Rights Act?
Yeah, so we're going to continue to work with partners and to work on that advocacy and campaigning as we have been over the last 3 years to get the Albanese government to legislate a Human Rights Act. And one thing with a new term in Parliament, there are a lot of new MPs we really want to meet with. There are also a lot of MPs who are long-term supporters of a Human Rights Act we'll be meeting with. There are MPs who might not have heard about the inquiry and so on, but might not have all the details about the Human Rights Act. And so a big focus of our work over the next few months is going to be meeting with those MPs across Parliament, building that support within Parliament. As I mentioned earlier, we also build and mobilise support amongst the public. And with this new term of Parliament, there's a really timely opportunity to meet with MPs if you are all constituents. So to meet with your MP to show them your support, your community support for a Human Rights Act. We know, again, there'll be lots of new MPs who'll be meeting with their constituents maybe for the first time. There'll be existing MPs looking to connect with constituents. And so if that is something you're interested in, we are rolling out training, supporting people. It may be something you've never done before. That's fine. It's not that difficult. It's really just talking to someone. We have a lot of resources and we are building groups of people. So you won't be alone who'll be meeting with their MPs around the country, talking to them about why you and your community supports the Human Rights Act and why you think they should support one too. And your voices as constituents are so important in this because we know, MPs need to know their constituents support something for them to act. So if it is something you're interested in, we will have a link in the chat. Do get involved. It's an amazing opportunity. There are a lot of things aligning in the campaign. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of support. And the time is now to really mobilize that support and show that support to your MP. So please do get involved if you're interested.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Nikita. Caitlin, what are the most important things that both individuals and organisations, including the Human Rights Law Centre, should do to make an Australian Human Rights Act a reality?
Thanks, Danny. Nikita's touched on a few of those already, but I think it's just really important to remember that we actually can make this kind of change when we come together, but it doesn't happen by itself. So 3 years ago, we were sitting here after the last federal election, and there were 3 big goals of the Human Rights Act campaign that the Human Rights Law Centre, along with Amnesty, and over 130 other organisations are now part of. Those 3 things we were aiming for then was to get the federal inquiry up, to get a clear recommendation for a Human Rights Act, and then to have the government implement that. 2 of those 3 have now been done. We have one more step. It's the most critical step. And so it's a really, really great chance to remind your friends, your neighbours, your colleagues, your organisations about the moment that this opportunity presents. We know that we've got the opportunities we've touched on. The government needs to respond to the inquiry recommendation. We've got international scrutiny and an opportunity coming up, as Hugh mentioned, with the Universal Periodic Review. So this is something that everybody can really get behind, but we also do need to recognise the reality of the environment that we operate in. We know that from the recent federal election result, Australians really do not want culture wars dominating their politics. We've had a clear rejection of that kind of politics for the moment, which is an opportunity we don't want to waste. But at the same time, we know from things like the defeat of the Voice referendum, as well as things that we see happening in other parts of the world, dis and misinformation are now part of our political and public landscape, unfortunately. So we've got to get ahead of this, and we've got to effectively outmaneuver those kinds of negative efforts, which are really aimed at denying basic legal protections for everyone. What we need is accessible and easily available, accurate information to show people what the benefits are. And then we all need to come together and work for it. Fortunately, both of those things are really well advanced. We've got, as I mentioned, over 130 organisations have joined the campaign, and we have a wealth of advocacy resources and information that you can use in your own work, as well as ways that you can be part of that strategy. So if you're an individual, you can go to the humanrightsact.org.au website and sign up to join the campaign as an individual. There's all sorts of materials there, from fact sheets to case studies to stories that you can use about how to talk about this, and practical examples of how a Human Rights Act, the Human Rights Acts we have in the 3 jurisdictions in Australia already with them, are already using this to benefit ordinary people who are just struggling to have their voices heard. If you're an organisation, you can sign up for the campaign as well, and then actually be part of the sort of the planning calls and so on that go, and the sharing of information around the campaign strategy. So there's many ways you can do that. Of course, if you use any of the main social media platforms, we're across all of those. You can follow the Human Rights Act campaign and share the content that comes out there. And lastly, if you're an organisation or an individual who's already engaging in advocacy or community organising, or just coming together within your community in different forms, you can talk about it. Talk about why we need our basic rights protected. If you're talking with your local MP, a senator, certainly federal ministers, please bring it up and remind people just how broad-based the support already is, and how much it's continuing to grow.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Caitlin. I'm going to be putting links in the webinar chat now for the links to the humanrightsact.org.au website, the Human Rights Commission's Free and Equal website, and also the Amnesty International Meet Your MP about a Human Rights Act that Nikita mentioned in her remarks. So if people can see that, that's fantastic. And please check out all 3 of those links and get involved, because they're all excellent places to go to find out more about why we need a Human Rights Act, some of the arguments and resources to help make that a reality, as well as how to make sure you get plugged in and connected, because we can only achieve this together. We've got a whole bunch of questions in the chat, so I'm going to go through as many as we can before we run out of time. So the first question that I've got is, would there need to be a Human Rights Act federally and in every state? Who would like to have a go at that one?
I'm happy to, but also happy for Caitlin and Nikita to have a go. I don't mind. I'll go, and then Caitlin, you jump in. And great questions, by the way. I was just reading them then, and I see there's a few people who've asked similar questions. So the model that the Commission proposed through the Free and Equal project for a National Human Rights Act was aimed at imposing obligations on the federal government. So federal government agencies like departments, Medicare, National Disability Insurance Agency, Australian Federal Police, and the like. That would complement well the State and Territory Human Rights Act. So the Victorian Human Rights Charter, the ACT Human Rights Act, and the Queensland Human Rights Act apply to state government public authorities, state government bodies, and where there's private bodies that are doing work on behalf of the state, like a private prison provider, for example. So ideally what you want is a Federal Human Rights Act as an act of the Australian Parliament applying to the Australian government, and then State and Territory Human Rights Acts applying to those relevant governments in each state and territory across the country to provide that comprehensive protections. There's lots of different models. The model we've recommended is essentially the model in Victoria, Victoria, ACT, and Queensland, also UK, New Zealand, like countries like Canada as well.
Anybody else wish to add to that quick answer?
I think just to make the point that we are a federal system, and so a federal Human Rights Act is needed to cover the breadth, but that doesn't take away from making sure that it doesn't matter where you live in the country, you should have the same level of human rights protections. So we've got examples from elsewhere, as Hugh's mentioned, but we also we have the extra complexity of states and territories as well, and the more that everybody knows that wherever they live, they've got the same level of human rights protection, the better.
Thank you so much for that, Hugh and Caitlin. Okay, the next question to ask is Gay asks the question, so there isn't a need for a referendum?
I'm happy to jump in there and say, no, the good news is there isn't a need for a referendum. This can be an act of parliament, just like any other law. And that is important because it's going to be much easier to pass than a referendum. As we all have seen, they are very difficult in this country, particularly if you don't have bipartisan support. But it can be an act of parliament, just like any other. And one of the advantages of that over a referendum that I think it's worth noting at this moment is that it means it can be changed in the future, which isn't something we always think of as a good thing. But at the moment, there is a big push internationally in different countries for the recognition of the right to a healthy environment to be protected as part of human rights acts. That's something that the ACT last year became the first jurisdiction in Australia to protect in their Human Rights Act the right to a healthy environment. And so by having this as an act of parliament, not only is it something that we can pass, is a lot more likely to pass than a referendum, but it's also something that it means as human rights evolve, we can ensure that they are protected in the Human Rights Act. The Victorian Act, when it was passed, only covered civil and political rights, and what we've seen with other states like Queensland passing their acts is they're including more rights. So we really want this to be something that is a strong basis. It covers as many human rights as possible, but we also have the ability to add, rights like the right to healthy environment that are so important to ensure people's rights are realized in this country.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Nikita. Hugh, Caitlin, anything to add to that?
I think it's covered it.
Fantastic. Okay, I've got a question from Andrew, which is, which other liberal democracies in the world do not yet have human rights legislation in this general form?
I'll just jump in and make it really clear that we are the only liberal democracy without this level of basic human rights protection, whether it's in a constitution or whether it's in basic legislation. So we are very much behind where most of our kind of peer countries are, and it's really the missing piece in our legal framework. We have a whole lot of really fantastic kind of protections and institutions, but we know that there's gaps between them and people are falling through those. So this is just filling in and completing the kind of basics of our legal framework that would make sure that we're actually able to not only live up to our international obligations that we've promised and the standards that we expect of other countries to fulfill, but giving people then the reassurance that they're not going to be left behind.
Thank you for that, Caitlin. Anyone else wish to add to that? Because if not, I'll move to a question from Eugene, which is, I've always operated on the assumption that a human rights instrument was always appropriate for Australia and we in Queensland and some other jurisdictions. Federally, and the 2009 Brennan Inquiry and the Parliament's Joint Committee on Human Rights favoured a Federal Human Rights Act. Why hasn't this been implemented yet? And how will this be rectified as soon as possible?
One thing I would highlight that is different today than in 2019 is those state acts that they have been in place for a lot longer. Queensland's only been in place since 2019, or it began operating in 2020. But now we do have examples of different states, how human rights acts have worked in them. Obviously, there's improvements that could be made with those acts, but we know that they improve people's lives. We have examples of that. This isn't a novel thing anymore. As Caitlin mentioned, every other liberal democracy in the world has one. So we have a lot more examples than we did in 2009 of how these practically work. A lot of the concerns people raised in 2009 that, for example, it would flood the courts, we know those aren't a real concern anymore because we know people prefer mediation and to resolve issues before they go to court. And the other thing I think that's different in 2009 is we have seen, I think as those state acts have shown their use, that people's opinions have also changed, and perhaps most significantly in the last few months, we've seen Bob Carr come out and say he now supports the Human Rights Act and was formerly opposed to them. And with things like the Robo-Debt Royal Commission, the Disability, the Aged Care Royal Commission, there's an increasing understanding of how human rights can be impacted and everyone's human rights. This isn't just something that affects marginalized communities. It can happen to anyone. And so journalists being raided by the Australian Federal Police, there's an understanding, I think, that's changed. And we see most predominantly with Bob Carr coming out in support of a Human Rights Act, that how necessary this is. And so hopefully that realization puts us in a different position, as well as the state acts. There's big movements in New South Wales and South Australia and other states for Human Rights Acts, as well as the Federal Act. And so we're seeing a different landscape than in 2009.
Thanks, Nikita. Anyone wish to add to that, Caitlin, Hugh?
Just in 2009, there was massive support. There was the largest consultation, one of the largest consultations ever conducted, led by Father Frank Brennan, Jesuit priest, who is, I think, a self-avowed fence sitter on whether or not to have a Human Rights Act. The process of going through those consultations, I think, for him, firmly convinced for him that there was an important reform, alongside other reforms like improved human rights education. So one of the biggest opponents at that time was News Limited, media. And you fast forward a few years when the Australian Federal Police are executing a warrant on the home of one of their journalists, and you have the CEO of News Limited talking about human rights, and you have media companies saying we need stronger protections of human rights, we need a Human Rights Act. That's one of the reasons Bob Carr came out and changed his view around that. And so the landscape has changed, I think, significantly since 2009, as Nikita pointed out.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. I'm going to take on the moderator prerogative and add to that answer, as well as answer another question, which is the Human Rights Law Centre consulting people and organisations of diverse political, social, cultural views, which the Human Rights Law Centre may not agree with, in the Human Rights Law Centre's advocacy for an Australian Human Rights Act? And the answer is, one of the other things I should note about past efforts to achieve a Human Rights Act is the majority of the people who would talk in favour of a Human Rights Act are people who were human rights advocates and people who are from the legal profession or legal type organisations. And that's fantastic and essential that they're talking about a Human Rights Act. But if a Human Rights Act benefits everyone, then there should be a diverse range of people speaking across the community about why we need a Human Rights Act and how it benefits everyone across the community. And so that's one of the reasons why the Human Rights Act campaign is 132 organisations, and people with disability organisations, children's rights organisations, organisations regarding women, social services, trade unions, faith organisations. It is a very broad, diverse coalition of organisations who are part of calling for an Australian Human Rights Act because it benefits everyone. And so that is one of the other lessons learned from advocacy in the past, which is to make sure you have a broad, diverse range of voices speaking in favour of Human Rights Act, because at the end of the day, human rights advocates and legal advocates are excellent. But if you're a person with disability, you're more likely to listen to a person with disability or an organisation representing people with disability when it comes to how Human Rights Act can benefit their particular part of the community, and so on and so forth. So the answer is the Human Rights Law Centre and the Human Rights Act campaign is a diverse coalition, diverse range of organisations. But one of the great things is they're all united about calling for a Human Rights Act, because those rights can benefit everyone across the community, and because those rights are broad in what they outline, they can be tailored to how they support particular people in particular circumstances as a consequence of that. So I hope that answers that question. Next question that I've got is, I might throw this to you, Caitlin, and then Hugh, if you wish to add to it, which is, how will access to justice measures be strengthened with a Human Rights Act?
Yeah, thanks, Danny. And I think this also goes to one of the other questions as well, just around kind of the enforceability of human rights. And one of the really exciting things that's both featured as part of the Human Rights Commission's recommendations, as well as what the model that has been put forward by the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights, is to improve upon what we have at the state and territory level and enable people to use a Federal Human Rights Act as a direct basis to go and seek assistance and to seek justice. So in certainly in Queensland and Victoria, for example, you can't go directly to court. You need to have another issue that you've brought up, and then you can raise your human rights issues as well. And that's really been a barrier to people being able to really make the human rights protections meaningful and a real tool, a practical tool for people to use. So that's been improved in the model that's being put forward, and that is the basis of your access to justice. Access to justice ultimately requires, clear and accessible information and a clear pathway to be able to seek justice when you need it. So that's baked into the very heart of the proposed model for a Human Rights Act at the federal level, which is great.
Thank you for that, Caitlin. Anything you wish to add to that, Hugh?
Yeah, endorse what Caitlin said, but also just add that there's a power. I'm grabbing something. This is the Victorian Charter of Human Rights. It's a very easy to understand piece of legislation as far as legislation goes. And there's a real access to justice power in this document, because anyone can read it and understand what the rights protected in this are. And some of the examples, the Human Rights Law Centre's got a fantastic online publication called 101 Case Studies, where how Human Rights Acts in Australia have made a difference. And some of those are big matters. Some of them are small but important matters to people's lives. And that's where, for example, an elderly woman who was being showered in, I think it was in an aged care home, without the shower curtain drawn, advocated for her right to privacy, or a man with cognitive disability whose mail was being opened by the residential disability facility, complained about that and said, "Why are you opening my mail?" And they said, "Well, we need to find out if there's bills that need to be paid." Him and his advocate said, I've got cognitive disability, I'm perfectly capable of identifying a bill from another letter and identifying that should be paid. I have a right to privacy, don't open my mail, and achieve that outcome. So you talk about access to justice and people's heads go to courts and those systems. What a Human Rights Act does, it provides very localised, accessible remedies to say, these are my rights, please respect them. If they don't, you can complain to the organisation, you can complain to, in our model, to the Australian Human Rights Commission, or in Queensland to the Queensland Commission, ACT Commission, but working properly, what a Human Rights Act does is build that culture of prevention. It builds that culture of public servants and people delivering services, understanding people's rights, thinking about the human impact of their actions, and that prevents rights breaches from happening in the first place. But of course, you need to have enforceable remedies, otherwise rights aren't taken seriously.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Hugh. And I noticed that Victorian Charter is very well worn, so I suspect you've had a lot of
copy from 2006, so still got it.
There you go. Nikita, I've got a question for you. Could you please provide examples of what we can actually say to MPs for those of us with less experience with advocacy?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have, I don't have a copy in front of me right now. We're just finalizing it. A two-pager guide of points to raise with MPs, as well as questions they might ask, how you can respond to them, and so on, that we are working on, as well as the training that we offer on how to meet with MPs. It covers, all the basics from organizing the meeting to what to expect during a meeting to how to follow up. So we have all those resources that we are working on, we should have really soon. And if you are interested in meeting your MP and sign up to the link that Danny will share, we'll be able to share all of them with you. But yeah, lots of resources, lots of guidance. If you haven't met with an MP before, we're here to support you to do it. And it's an important thing to do. So please do reach out if there's anything we can do to help.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Nikita. Next, there's a couple of questions on the same theme, so I'm just going to coalesce them together into a single one, which basically refers to the fact that in Queensland, their Human Rights Act's been overridden a couple of times in the last couple of years to pass laws with respect to children in the criminal justice system. What can we do to make sure we don't see a repetition of that happening at the federal level with a federal Human Rights Act, or is it a case of that's something which can be done regardless of what Human Rights Act gets implemented?
I'll start and see if others want to jump in on this one.
I'm happy to, yep.
Look, I mean, I think what's really important in the context of the proposal that's been put forward and the experience that we've seen with the state and territory legislation is that this is really finding a balance between the importance of respecting what parliaments do as the elected representatives and the idea of parliamentary sovereignty with building in the human rights protections. And yes, that does mean that sometimes the state governments have chosen to disregard that. But they also then have to be really explicit that they are actually breaching human rights. And then we have to make sure that we are all collectively leaning in through the democratic process to hold them accountable for why they're doing so and the implications of that. And this is a balance, this idea of a dialogue model, that it is a dialogue between the branches of government. It's not providing, some concerns originally that had been raised around overreach by the courts. The courts are there. People can go to the courts as they can anytime, they should be able to anytime their rights are violated. But it's a discussion then effectively between the judiciary on an individual case and where the parliament then sits in terms of looking at how it's putting rights protections in place. And as Hugh mentioned before, the focus of a Human Rights Act ultimately is really to prevent these things taking place in the first place by making sure that there is an obligation to think about the impact on people's rights in public decision making. It doesn't prevent governments still making laws from time to time, but they have to be also really, really clear and explicit about the rationale for doing so.
I was just going to add, yeah, it's a trade-off. You can go for constitutional protection of human rights, which is like a super law that the Parliament can't override, and so but that comes with it the need for a referendum and the inflexibility as well. So our model calls for a legislative Human Rights Act. That means Parliament is supreme. Parliament can change that law if it likes. Nikita pointed out ACT has changed the law many times, each time to improve it over the years since 2004. But it's a bad outcome in Queensland that you have these new laws. These laws, I think, will drive crime up. They will harm children in the process. That harm will be applied unequally to First Nations children will bear the brunt of that, and so these are bad laws that shouldn't have passed. What can you say about what a Human Rights Act does there? Creates that transparency. So if you can read the statement of compatibility that the government put with those laws that said it's going to indirectly, disproportionately impact on First Nations children. It's not justified from a safety concern. So It doesn't prevent the Parliament from passing those laws, but it creates transparency around it. And from what government MPs and ministers tell us is that the debate about those laws is absolutely framed in human rights terms. So it forces governments to think about those the rights of children in that process. They might arrive at a different conclusion when they take the bill to Parliament, and the Parliament might approve it, but it's better protection than if you didn't have a Human Rights Act.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Caitlin and Hugh. And you also helped answer a couple other questions that came up around a Bill of Rights in the process. So that's very efficient. Thank you for that. I've received a couple of questions regarding self-determination for First Nations people, as well as implementing the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So I'm going to suggest that they're close enough to be related to each other to probably answer in the same question. Is it possible for anyone on this panel to comment on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, self-determination for First Nations peoples, and free, prior, and informed consent, and how that relates to the Federal Human Rights Act and what's been proposed by the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights?
I can start on that one. What's been proposed by the Parliamentary Joint Committee, I think, is a quite practical kind of path through, and that Parliamentary Joint Committee did have First Nations parliamentary representation on it. And what's been proposed is that first of all, for the government to seek legal advice around how to most effectively incorporate those elements of human rights obligations, because First Nations Indigenous rights are human rights as well. And so that there's a recommendation to look into the detail of that a bit more. But the specific proposal is to make sure that there is a clear recognition in the preamble of a draft law that grounds it in a recognition of those rights, because then, of course, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, along with everybody else, should be entitled to all of the other protections. And the first article of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People reaffirms and reasserts the importance of that broad-based human rights protection. So there's nothing incompatible between them, and there's just some sort of technical details to work through. But the other piece that's in the proposed legislation also goes to one of the other questions. There's a couple of questions there around children's rights as well. And the proposed model includes what's called a sort of a positive duty on a participatory duty, for public decision makers to consult with particular groups of people who may be particularly affected in terms of their rights, both children's rights, First Nations rights, as well as the rights of people with disabilities. And so those are elements that have also been baked into the model to make sure that there is specific consideration around consulting with affected communities in the exercise of public decisions that might affect those areas of rights.
I might just add to that, Danny, again, that 101 case studies, there's good examples from Queensland, ACT and Victoria about how those human rights acts have advanced First Nations people's rights. Obviously, the Human Rights Law Centre ran a case with Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service to get First Nations children out of an adult security prison. That's just one of many examples, cultural rights and others. There was a question in the chat about children's rights and how you balance like court decisions around access from parents who perpetrated family violence to have contact with their children. How do you balance that against this right to safety of a child? And it's an important question, and one of the great benefits of a Human Rights Act is that it provides a means or a compass or a guide to help resolve really difficult policy questions, like the one posted in the chat about a parent who's perpetrated family violence. We know children benefit from having contact and with their parents. There's a right to family. There's also a right to safety. There's a right to act in the best interests of children and for them to be protected according to their best interests. So how do you balance that? What a Human Rights Act would say, if you're going to limit any of those rights, you need to have a good reason for it, and you need to do it in the least restrictive way possible. And that very simple test, whether you apply it to protest rights and rights to safety and right to equality, or hate speech, whether you apply it to this context, whether you apply it to any context where there are rights that are intersecting, it provides a very powerful and helpful tool to try and get to the right decision and good policy decisions that maximise those competing rights to the greatest possible extent. And in my career, looking at law reform, I found that test to be incredibly helpful in those difficult policy situations.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Caitlin and Hugh. I've got a question from Christine. Great to see you. What effect will a Human Rights Act have on big government decisions like budgets and grants commission decisions and the like?
Well, a Human Rights Act would apply to all public decision making by the federal government. So there's it provides a basis for human rights considerations to be taken into account in the types of examples that you've mentioned. And that's part of the power of it. Often it's looking at where resources are allocated that actually makes the most difference. It's not necessarily only in the delivery of services or other kind of forms of regulation. So that's one of the powers of having something that is a broad-based umbrella piece of legislation that puts the obligation on all public decision makers to think about what does this actually mean for people and their most basic fundamental rights, whether it's health, education, housing, clean air. There's a question in there around the right to a healthy environment, and that is proposed to be included as one of the most critical newer areas of rights protections that we know is going to connect and will affect everybody's human rights in the most extreme way as the climate crisis continues its current trajectory. So that's why it's such a powerful tool, and why it really is that missing piece in our legal framework.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Caitlin. We're getting close to time, so I'm going to go through a couple of the last questions before we wrap up. And my apologies in advance for anyone whose question we haven't been able to get to. The second last question to ask, I'll just ask maybe Hugh for you to answer this one briefly, is the UN Sustainable Development Goals relevant to support making human rights issues a domestic concern for a Human Rights Act?
The UN, those goals aren't framed in explicit human rights terms, but they relate directly to human rights outcomes. And the Australian government has made commitments to implement those goals. And so they're like those international commitments in terms of the treaties and the support for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's important that Australia plays a constructive international role as a good global citizen upholding those rights. What we need to do is live up to those promises back home in Australia, and so they provide further impetus for the need for a Human Rights Act in Australia.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And I might leave as the last question. Do we need to campaign for a Human Rights Act with state-by-state action? We know the federal government doesn't always change states, and we saw Prime Minister Albanese say that raising the age of criminal responsibility is a state-by-state basis issue.
I think one thing that's really important when it comes to this in campaigning, not just for a federal act that will take precedence over the states, but having state acts and a federal act, is the role of that positive duty that Caitlin has mentioned in getting governments to think about human rights when making decisions. And that's not something you can force on governments. You want them to take that responsibility on and to build that. That's going to be a very long-term thing, but to build that over time, that education in with public servants, within departments of thinking about human rights, mitigating human rights abuses. And we don't want to force that on state governments. We want them to take that responsibility on and build that on over time. And that's why it's so important to have state acts as well as the federal act.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that response, Nikita. We've hit 2 o'clock, so we want to make sure that we finish on time as we promised you all. Sorry to everyone that we weren't able to answer your questions during the course of it, but just to let you know, over the course of the question and answer session, we answered 34 questions one way or another. So hopefully we did our best to make sure we answered as many questions as possible. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. A huge thank you to Hugh, Kretser, Nikita White, and Caitlin Reiger for those incredible insights. You can take action to win an Australian Human Rights Act by signing up to humanrightsact.org.au and following the Australian Human Rights Act campaign on Instagram, Facebook, and Blue Sky. You can check out the Australian Human Rights Commission's Free and Equal report showing why we need to act and what benefits it provides at humanrights.gov.au/free-and-equal. And you can find out more about Amnesty International Australia's Human Rights Act campaign at amnesty.org.au/campaigns/human-rights-act. Thank you so much, everyone, and a recording will be sent to people who've attended this session today. Thank you and have a great day, and keep up the work to win an Australian Human Rights Act.